The worst kind of silence is when you are screaming for help and the person you trust most chooses not to hear it. I remember staring at my phone screen inside the hospital room, watching my mother's contact name light up again and again with no answer coming through. My name is Emily Carter, and I never thought the sound of a phone vibrating could feel like both hope and punishment at the same time. The hospital room was too bright in a way that felt unnatural, the white lights reflecting off the polished surfaces, the steady beeping of machines filling every pause where comfort was supposed to exist. A nurse had just adjusted the 4-line near my arm, speaking softly but urgently about keeping my stress levels low, though I could barely focus on her words. All I could focus on was the phone in my hand, because every missed call felt like another step further away from the only person I thought would come if I needed her. He had called my mother 7 times in the last hour. Each call rang long enough to give me hope before ending in silence. No voicemail. No message. Just nothing. I tried my sister next, but I already knew she would not answer either. Still, I called again anyway, as if repetition could somehow change reality. The doctor had explained earlier that my condition had suddenly worsened after what was supposed to be a routine checkup. They were still running tests, still monitoring everything closely, but the way they spoke carried a tone I could not ignore. It was the kind of tone medical professionals use when they do not want to alarm you, even though they already are. I kept telling myself that my mother was just busy, that maybe she was driving or in a meeting or had her phone on silent. But deep down, I knew something was wrong in a different way. Not medically. Emotionally. Because my mother always answered. Even when she was upset. Even when she was busy. Even when she had nothing to say, she still answered. But not today. The nurse returned again, glancing at my phone and then at me with a careful expression. Do you want us to try emergency contact again? She asked gently. I nodded quickly, even though I had already tried everything. They called her from the hospital line this time. I listened as the nurse spoke, explaining my situation in calm professional language that somehow made everything feel even more real. I heard pauses on the other end of the call, brief moments where someone was clearly listening. Then the nurse lowered the phone slightly, her expression shifting just a little as she looked at me. She said she will call back later, the nurse said softly. Later. The word stayed in my mind longer than it should have. I stared at the ceiling for a moment, trying to process how something so simple could feel so heavy. Later meant I was not urgent enough. Later meant there was something more important happening right now. Later meant I could wait. But my body did not feel like it could wait. My hands were shaking slightly, though I tried to hide it by gripping the blanket tighter. I told myself again that there must be a reason, that maybe my sister needed her, maybe something small had come up, maybe I was overthinking it. But then I heard something from the hallway outside my room. Laughter. Music. The kind of sound that does not belong in a hospital corridor. It was distant but clear enough to make me pause. A group of nurses passed by speaking quietly to each other, one of them mentioning something about a party upstairs and family celebration. I did not understand at first, not fully, until I asked one of them what they meant. She hesitated before answering, as if she was not sure whether she should say it. There is a gathering at a private residence connected to your family, she said carefully. We heard your sister is hosting something tonight. The words did not make sense at first. Not because I could not understand them, but because they did not align with the reality I was living in at that moment. I was in a hospital bed, connected to monitors, waiting for answers about my own body, while somewhere else, my sister was hosting a celebration. And my mother had chosen not to answer the phone. For a moment after hearing that my sister was hosting a party while I lay in a hospital bed, I thought I must have misunderstood the words. I kept replaying them in my head, trying to rearrange the meaning into something less sharp, something less impossible. A celebration. A gathering. A family event. Those were normal things. People went to parties all the time. People also went to hospitals all the time. But what did not feel normal was the distance between those two realities when they belonged to the same family at the same time. I turned my head slightly toward the window in my room, though there was nothing outside but the blurred reflection of the fluorescent hallway lights. The nurse had left a few minutes earlier, promising she would check on my mother again, but I already knew what the answer would be. My phone remained in my hand, now heavier than before, as if each missed call had accumulated weight that I could physically feel. He tried calling again. The same result. One ring, then silence. No answer. He lowered the phone slowly, staring at the contact name as if it might change if I looked long enough. Somewhere in the hallway, I heard footsteps again, followed by distant voices discussing visitor schedules and evening routines. Life continued normally outside my room, as if nothing urgent was happening inside it. He pressed the call button near my bed and waited. A different nurse entered this time, younger, with a gentle expression that immediately softened when she saw my face. Still no response, she asked quietly. He shook my head. She hesitated before stepping closer, glancing at the monitor beside me as if confirming what she already knew from the chart. We can escalate the contact attempt, she said carefully. But your mother has not answered any of our calls either. That sentence landed differently because it was no longer just my experience. It was now verified by the hospital itself. He felt my throat tighten slightly, though I tried to remain calm. Can you try my sister again? He asked. The nurse nodded and stepped out. I listened as she made the call from the hallway, her voice professional but increasingly uncertain. A few seconds passed. Then longer. I could hear faint background noise through the open door, something light and rhythmic, like music. Not hospital music. Something else. When she returned, her expression had changed just slightly. Not alarmed, but more careful. She did not answer either, she said. Then she paused before adding, it sounds like there is a gathering happening at her location. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not because I was tired, but because I did not know how to process the simplicity of that statement compared to the situation I was in. A gathering. A party. While I was in a hospital bed waiting for updates about my own condition. The nurse continued speaking, her tone now more hesitant. We received confirmation from another contact that your family is currently attending an event, she said. It appears to be a celebration related to your sister. He opened my eyes again and stared at her. And my mother? He asked. She looked down briefly at the chart in her hands before responding. She was seen there earlier this evening. There was no judgment in her voice. Only information. That information was enough. He felt something inside me shift, not dramatically, but quietly, like a realization settling into place after resisting it for too long. My mother was not unaware. She was not unreachable. She was present somewhere else. He thought about all the times she had answered immediately in the past for smaller things. Minor concerns. Simple questions. Even late-night phone calls that did not matter nearly as much as this one. And yet now, in what the hospital described as a serious condition requiring immediate family contact, she was not available. He looked at the ceiling again, trying to steady my breathing. The nurse adjusted my foreline gently, speaking softly about keeping calm and allowing the doctors to continue monitoring my condition. Her words felt distant, like they belonged to a different conversation happening far away. He asked one final question without looking at her. Did they say anything when you told them it was urgent? There was a pause before she answered. They said they would return the call after the event. After the event. The phrase echoed in my mind in the same way later had before it, but now it felt more defined. More intentional. It meant I was not the priority. It meant something. Else had already been chosen. And in that quiet hospital room, surrounded by machines that were monitoring every small change in my body, I realized I was waiting for my own family to decide when I mattered. The nurse's words stayed in my mind longer than the silence that followed her departure. After the event. It was such a simple phrase, but it carried a finality that made everything inside me feel increasingly detached, as if I was no longer part of the same timeline as my own family. He lay still in the hospital bed, staring at the ceiling while the steady rhythm of the monitors continued beside me, marking time in a way that felt indifferent to what I was experiencing. My body was being observed, measured, and cared for, yet the people who were supposed to care the most were somewhere else choosing something else. He turned my head slightly toward the window again, though nothing had changed outside. The hallway lights still cast their pale reflection across the glass, and occasional footsteps still passed by, reminding me that life outside my room continued without pause. He tried to focus on something small, something grounding, but my thoughts kept returning to my mother's unanswered calls. Each missed ring no longer felt like individual moments of absence. They had begun to form a pattern, and patterns were harder to dismiss than single actions. He pressed the call button again, not because I expected a different outcome, but because silence had become more difficult to accept than disappointment. A different nurse entered shortly after, carrying a tablet and a calm expression that suggested she already understood what I was going to ask before I said anything. "Any response?" she asked softly. He shook my head. She checked the screen briefly, then spoke in a measured tone. "We attempted contact again through the primary and secondary numbers listed," she said. "There has been no answer." The clinical phrasing made it sound even more distant, as if my mother and sister were not simply unavailable but removed from reach entirely. He felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the blanket, though I tried to remain still. "Did you tell them it was urgent?" he asked again, my voice quieter than before. The nurse hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Yes," she said. "We emphasized the medical priority level." She paused, then added, "We were informed that they are currently still engaged in a family event." The word engaged struck me oddly in that moment. Not because it was incorrect, but because it implied presence, attention, and participation somewhere else while I was lying here waiting for acknowledgement that never arrived. He looked away from her, toward the ceiling again, as if answers might be found in the structure above me rather than in the room itself. The nurse adjusted a small monitor beside my bed, checking readings that I had stopped trying to understand fully. "Your condition remains stable for now," she said gently. "But we would prefer immediate family awareness in case anything changes." Immediate family awareness. The phrase should have meant reassurance. Instead, it highlighted absence. He realized then that no matter how stable my medical charts appeared, the emotional reality was already unstable in a different way. The hospital could measure my body, but it could not measure why I was alone in this moment. Another call attempt was made, this time through a hospital coordinator who spoke more firmly into the phone. I could hear fragments of the conversation from the doorway, enough to recognize repetition of urgency, confirmation of identity, and polite insistence on response. But what came back, eventually, was the same answer. No immediate availability. After the event. The coordinator ended the call and stood quietly for a moment before stepping into my room. "They acknowledged the message," he said. "But they're not leaving at this time." He nodded slowly, though I did not feel like I was agreeing with anything. He was simply acknowledging that I had reached a point where the situation was no longer about misunderstanding. It was about choice. He lay there for a long time afterward, listening to the rhythm of the machines and the distant sounds of the hospital continuing its work around me. He thought about how easily a person could be physically present in one place while emotionally excluded from another. He thought about how a family could exist in multiple rooms at the same time and still fail to be together when it mattered most. And in that quiet realization, I began to understand that the most painful part of being in that hospital was not the uncertainty about my condition, but the certainty that someone had already decided I could wait. The next few hours in the hospital passed in a way that felt suspended, as if time itself had stopped trying to be meaningful. He remained in the same bed, in the same position, listening to the same steady rhythm of machines that measured my condition with a precision that contrasted sharply with the emotional uncertainty I was experiencing. No one from my family called back. No message appeared. No explanation followed the earlier statement that they were still at the event. He began to notice how the absence of response had evolved from confusion into something more defined, something closer to confirmation. The nurses continued their routine checks, speaking softly, asking if I needed water or if I was experiencing any discomfort, but even their presence could not distract from the fact that every attempt to reach my mother had ended in the same outcome. He asked again at one point, almost without expecting an answer anymore, whether there had been any change. The nurse shook her head gently. "No new response," she said. "They are still listed as unavailable." The words felt procedural, but they carried emotional weight that no medical terminology could fully neutralize. He turned my head toward the window again, though the outside world offered no comfort. The night had deepened, and the hospital lights reflected faintly against the glass, creating a layered image of my room overlapping with the darkness beyond. It made me feel even more isolated, as if I existed in a space that was physically connected to everything but emotionally separate from it. At some point, a new staff member entered with updated information, reviewing my chart and confirming stability in my condition. I spoke carefully, avoiding unnecessary alarm, but I noticed the subtle emphasis on continued monitoring. We will maintain observation through the night, he said. Given the lack of family response, we are adjusting protocol to ensure full medical oversight. The phrase lack of family response stayed with me longer than anything else he said. It reduced everything that had happened outside these walls into a clinical absence, but I knew it meant something far more personal. He asked quietly if there had been any clarification from my mother or sister. The answer was the same as before, delivered with professional restraint. No response. Still at the event. He repeated those words in my mind, trying to understand how an event could hold more priority than this moment. He was not angry in the way I expected to be. Instead, I felt a slow, steady recognition forming, something that did not erupt but settled. It was the understanding that urgency is not universal, and that being in distress does not automatically place you at the center of someone else's attention. Hours passed without change. The hospital shifted into its nighttime rhythm, with fewer footsteps in the hallway and longer stretches of silence between check-ins. I lay there thinking about earlier moments in my life when I had assumed presence meant priority, when I believed that family meant immediate response. Those assumptions felt increasingly distant now, replaced by something more difficult to accept. At one point, I overheard a brief conversation outside my room between two staff members discussing routine updates. One of them mentioned that my emergency contacts had been informed multiple times without reply. The other responded simply, as if it was not unusual in their experience. Some families delay response during gatherings, he said. But in that moment, the word delay felt inaccurate. Delay implied intention to act later. What I was experiencing felt more like displacement, as if my situation existed outside the current priorities of the people I had expected to matter most. I closed my eyes for a while, not sleeping, just trying to steady my thoughts. When I opened them again, the room had not changed, but something in my understanding had. I no longer waited for the phone to ring with expectation. I waited with awareness that it might not ring at all. And in that quiet acceptance, I began to realize that being ignored was not just an absence of response. It was a decision made somewhere else, in a place I could not see, where my urgency had already been measured and set aside in favor of something else that did not include me. The night in the hospital continued without any meaningful change, but something inside me was no longer following the same rhythm as the environment around me. The machine still monitored my condition with steady precision, the monitor still blinked softly in the dimmed room, and the hallway outside still carried the occasional footsteps of nurses moving between patients, yet none of it felt connected to the part of me that was waiting for a simple phone call that never came. He had stopped counting the attempts to reach my mother because counting had begun to feel like a way of pretending I still had influence over the outcome. Each passing hour made it clearer that I did not. At some point during the night, a nurse entered quietly with a tablet, checking my updated vitals and confirming that my condition remained stable. She spoke in a calm, practiced tone, but I noticed a slight change in how she looked at me, something closer to sympathy that was no longer masked by routine professionalism. "We will continue monitoring you closely," she said. "There is still no response from your emergency contacts." He nodded slightly, though I did not feel like I was receiving new information anymore. He was only receiving confirmation of what had already become reality. After she left, I found myself staring at the ceiling again, trying to separate physical discomfort from emotional exhaustion. It was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. The absence of communication from my family had started to feel like a physical presence in the room, not loud or aggressive, but constant and heavy in a way that could not be ignored. He thought about what the nurse had said earlier, that my mother had been informed repeatedly, and I wondered how many times a person could choose not to respond before that choice became something more deliberate than circumstance. At one point, another staff member came in briefly to adjust the monitor and update my chart. It mentioned that hospital protocol required continued attempts to reach family members throughout the night, but his tone suggested that such attempts were becoming procedural rather than hopeful. "We will keep trying," he said, almost automatically, as if repeating a standard line that applied regardless of outcome. After he left, the room felt quieter than before, not because the sound level had changed, but because expectation had begun to fade. I realized I was no longer waiting for my phone to ring with anticipation. I was waiting with acknowledgement that it might remain silent indefinitely. That realization did not come as shock. It came as a gradual acceptance that built slowly over hours of repeated absence. I turned my head slightly toward the window again, though the outside world remained unchanged. The hospital lights reflected faintly against the glass, blending the interior of the room with the darkness outside in a way that made it difficult to distinguish boundaries. I began to think about how quickly priorities could shift in ways that left certain people behind without any formal announcement. Somewhere in another place, my sister was still hosting her gathering. Somewhere in that same place, my mother was still present, still choosing to remain there instead of answering repeated calls from a hospital. The contrast between those two realities no longer felt confusing. It felt defined. My condition was being monitored, documented, and managed by professionals who treated urgency as a structured system, while my family's response existed in a completely different system where urgency had been evaluated and ranked lower than social engagement. I lay still for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of machines that did not care about priorities, only measurements. At some point, I stopped checking my phone altogether. Not because I had given up hope entirely, but because I had started to understand that hope was no longer tied to expectation. It was now tied to endurance. And as the night continued without interruption or response, I began to accept that being ignored was not a momentary lapse in attention, but a consistent pattern of choice that would define how this night would be remembered, regardless of how my condition changed by morning. By the time the hospital lights shifted into the deeper hours of the night, everything had become quieter, not in a comforting way, but in a way that made every sound feel more deliberate. The monitors beside my bed continued their steady rhythm, marking my condition with unchanged precision, while the rest of the world outside my room felt increasingly distant, as if I had been placed behind a layer of glass that separated me from any normal sense of connection. I had stopped expecting my phone to vibrate. The absence of calls from my mother or sister no longer felt like an interruption to hope. It had become the structure of the night itself. A nurse entered briefly to perform another routine check, her movements careful and practiced, her expression calm but no longer entirely neutral. She looked at the chart, then at me, and spoke in a voice that suggested repetition rather than new information. "Still no response from your emergency contacts," she said. I nodded slightly, not because I agreed, but because there was nothing left in me that required confirmation anymore. She adjusted the four-line and paused for a moment, as if considering whether to say more, then simply added, "We will continue monitoring you until morning." After she left, the silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt structured, like something had been removed and replaced with something heavier that did not move. I turned my head toward the window again, though nothing outside had changed. The same faint reflections of hallway lights, the same still darkness beyond the glass, the same sense that the world continued without acknowledging the space I was occupying. I thought about how quickly urgency could be diluted when it did not align with someone else's priorities. A medical emergency, once urgent by definition, had become something that could be postponed without immediate consequence to those who were not physically present. That realization did not arrive as a sudden emotional break. It formed slowly, through repetition, through silence, through the absence of every expected response. At some point, another staff member entered with a small tablet, reviewing updates and confirming that my condition remained stable. His tone was professional, but there was less optimism in it now, and more routine acceptance. "No changes from family contact attempts," he said briefly. "We will escalate again in the morning if necessary." Escalate. The word sounded procedural, but it carried an unintended weight. It implied that what should have already been urgent might need to become more formal before it was acknowledged again. After he left, I found myself no longer checking my phone at all. It remained in my hand for a while, then eventually I placed it beside me without looking at it. There was no longer a difference between waiting and not waiting, because both produced the same outcome. Silence. I closed my eyes for a short while, not sleeping, just resting in the absence of expectation. When I opened them again, the room felt unchanged, but my perception of it had shifted. The hospital was no longer a place where I was waiting for family response. It was a place where my condition was being observed independently of that response. The two systems had become separate. One measured my body. The other ignored my presence. Somewhere in the early hours, I overheard nurses outside my room speaking softly about overnight cases, shift changes, and contact logs. One of them mentioned that my file had multiple failed contact attempts marked as no response, a phrase that sounded neutral but carried cumulative meaning. Each attempt had been recorded, each failure documented, each silence preserved as data rather than emotion. I lay still, listening to the rhythm of that reality settling in. There was no dramatic moment of realization, no sudden shift in emotion. Only a steady understanding that what I had considered temporary absence was actually consistent behavior across time. My mother had not simply missed calls. She had repeatedly not answered them. My sister had not simply been distracted. She had remained unavailable throughout. A situation labeled as urgent by medical staff. And in that distinction between urgency defined by professionals and priority defined by family, I began to see the structure of something I had not been willing to name earlier. It was not just that I was waiting. It was that I had been placed in a position where waiting itself was the expected outcome. And as the night continued without interruption, I realized that the silence was no longer something happening around me. It was something I had fully entered. By the time the faintest hint of early morning light began to soften the darkness outside my hospital window, I had already lost track of how many hours had passed without a single response from my mother or my sister. The night no longer felt like a continuous stretch of time but like a series of quiet intervals separated by small medical checks, each one confirming the same unchanged reality. My condition was stable, according to the monitors, but everything outside of that stability felt increasingly unanchored. A nurse entered during shift transition, her movements slightly faster than before, carrying updated charts and briefly reviewing my file at the foot of my bed. She glanced at the screen, then at me, and spoke with a tone that suggested routine repetition. "We have continued attempts to reach your emergency contacts throughout the night," she said. "There is still no response recorded." I nodded once, not because I needed confirmation, but because I had reached a point where confirmation no longer changed anything. The words had become part of the background noise of my situation, like the steady beeping of the monitor or the distant movement of staff in the hallway. After she left, I found myself staring at the ceiling again, not searching for answers anymore, but simply observing how unchanged everything remained despite how much had shifted internally. At some point, a different nurse came in with the morning report and spoke more directly about escalation procedures. She explained that hospital protocol required continued contact attempts and that if necessary, social services or secondary emergency contacts would be notified. Her tone was careful, but there was an underlying sense that my situation had already moved beyond standard family communication expectations. "We understand this is not ideal," she said gently, "but we need someone physically available to acknowledge your condition." The phrase physically available lingered in my mind. It implied presence, responsibility, and acknowledgement, all things that had been absent throughout the night. I realized then that my mother and sister were not simply unreachable. They were categorized as unavailable in a system that measured urgency differently than I had ever been taught to understand it. I asked quietly if there had been any attempt made after midnight. The nurse checked the log and shook her head. "No successful contact," she confirmed. "Calls were placed, but there was no answer or callback." The simplicity of her explanation made it feel heavier, not lighter. There were no complications in the communication process, no technical failures, no confusion. Only repeated non-response. I turned my head slightly toward the window again, where the light outside had begun to shift into a softer gray, signaling the transition toward morning. Somewhere in that same world, my sister's gathering was still being referenced in earlier notes, still categorized as ongoing. Somewhere in that same world, my mother was still marked as present at that event. The contrast between those two realities and my own felt less like a contradiction now and more like separation into entirely different priorities that had never been aligned in the first place. A doctor entered briefly to review my condition and confirmed again that there were no immediate medical changes. His attention was professional, efficient, and focused entirely on physical stability. Before leaving, he paused at the door and asked if my family had made contact overnight. When I said no, he simply nodded, as if that answer was becoming expected rather than unusual. "We will continue to monitor both your condition and contact attempts," he said before exiting. After he left, the room felt quieter, not because anything had stopped, but because I had stopped anticipating interruption. I reached for my phone again at one point, though I did not call anyone this time. I only looked at the screen, scrolling through missed calls that had accumulated into a record of unanswered attempts. Each entry marked a moment where urgency had existed on my side but had not been mirrored on the other end. I began to notice that my understanding of urgency itself had started to change. In the hospital, urgency was immediate, structured, and continuously acted upon. Outside of it, urgency appeared conditional, dependent on context, demean, and personal priority. That difference no longer felt theoretical. It felt measurable through absence. As morning light slowly strengthened outside, I realized that I was no longer waiting for my family to respond in the same emotional way I had been during the night. Something in that expectation had already worn down. What remained was observation, awareness, and the quiet understanding that while my condition was still being treated as medically important, my presence in my family's immediate attention had not been treated with the same weight. And in that distinction, I began to understand that silence was not just what I had experienced. It was what had been consistently chosen. By the time the morning shift fully took over the hospital floor, the environment around me had shifted into a different rhythm, one that felt more structured, more procedural, and yet no less emotionally distant than the night before. The lighting in the room had changed slightly, becoming brighter and more clinical, revealing details that the dimness of night had softened. My hospital bed remained the same, the monitors still steady, the 4-line still running its quiet course, but everything now felt exposed in a way that made it harder to ignore the reality I had been sitting with for hours. A nurse entered during the morning rounds, carrying updated charts and briefly reviewing my condition with a calm, practiced expression. She glanced at the screen, then at me, and spoke in a tone that suggested continuity rather than change. "Your vitals remain stable," she said. "There are still no updates from your emergency contacts." I nodded slowly, though. The words no longer carried the same emotional weight they had during the night. They had become part of a record that continued to repeat itself without variation. After she left, I remained still for a moment, listening to the subtle sounds of the hospital shifting into daytime activity. Doors opening and closing, distant conversations, the steady movement of staff transitioning between patients. Life continued around me with efficiency and purpose, but none of it included me in a relational sense. I was present physically, but emotionally disconnected from the network that should have extended beyond these walls. At some point, a doctor entered to review my condition more thoroughly. He checked the monitor readings, asked a few standard questions about how I was feeling, and confirmed again that there were no immediate complications. His tone was professional and focused, as expected, but when he reached the end of his review, he paused briefly before asking a question that had been asked before but now carried a different implication. "Has your family made any contact yet?" he asked. He looked at him for a moment before responding. "No," I said simply. He nodded once, as if that answer had become routine in my file. "We will continue standard monitoring and contact procedures," he said before leaving the room. After he exited, I found myself no longer reacting to the question in the same way I had during the night. The absence of contact had transitioned from something that felt temporary or situational into something more consistent, something that had established its own pattern over time. I reached for my phone again out of habit rather than expectation. The screen lit up, showing the same list of missed calls, the same lack of responses, the same silence translated into digital records. I scrolled through it slowly, noticing not just the absence of replies but the accumulation of them, each one marking a moment where communication had been initiated but not returned. It was no longer just about one unanswered call or one missed moment. It was a series of repeated non-responses that formed a clear structure when viewed together. I placed the phone back down and stared toward the window again. Outside, the hospital grounds were now fully visible in daylight, people moving through their routines, cars arriving and leaving, life continuing in organized patterns that did not pause for individual circumstances. I began to understand something that had been forming gradually since the previous night. It was not just that my mother had not answered. It was that she had consistently not answered across time, across repeated attempts, across escalating urgency. And that consistency carried its own meaning, one that could no longer be explained by timing or coincidence alone. A nurse entered again later to adjust my fore and check my chart, speaking briefly about continued observation and possible discharge planning depending on further test results. Her voice was gentle, but the underlying message was clear. My medical condition was being managed according to protocol, independent of family response. We will keep your emergency contacts active in the system, she said before leaving. But I realized that activation in a system did not guarantee response in reality. After she left, I lay still for a long time, listening to the steady rhythm of the hospital that had become the only consistent presence in my experience since I arrived. The realization that had been forming slowly throughout the night and into the morning finally settled into clarity. My condition was not being ignored by the hospital. It was being actively monitored. But my place within my family's immediate attention had been repeatedly set aside, not once, but continuously, across every attempt made to reach them. And in that recognition, I understood that silence was no longer something happening around me. It was something that had already defined the space I was in. By the time the late morning sunlight fully filled the hospital room, everything inside me had reached a strange kind of stillness. It was not peace, and it was not acceptance in the comforting sense people often describe. It was simply the absence of expectation after too many repeated disappointments. The monitor beside my bed continued its steady rhythm, and the four-line continued its quiet work, but my attention was no longer focused on what my body was doing. It was focused on what my family was not doing. A nurse entered during rounds, carrying my updated chart, and paused briefly before speaking. Her tone was calm, but there was a familiarity in her expression now, as if she already anticipated the answer she was going to document. There have been no responses from your emergency contacts overnight or this morning, she said. He nodded once. It was no longer surprising. It was simply recorded reality. She adjusted the sheet at the foot of my bed and added, almost gently, we will continue attempts, but at this stage, we may need to rely on secondary contacts if the situation remains unchanged. After she left, I lay still for a long time, listening to the quiet mechanical consistency of the hospital. The sounds no longer felt intrusive. They felt structured, reliable, almost more dependable than anything outside these walls. I reached for my phone again, not out of hope, but out of habit. The screen lit up, showing the same list of missed calls, the same lack of replies, the same empty responses from numbers that should have mattered most. I did not scroll quickly anymore. I looked slowly, as if observing something that had finally become clear through repetition. Each missed call was not just an unanswered attempt. It was part of a pattern that had persisted long enough to define itself. A doctor entered briefly later in the morning, reviewing my condition and confirming that I remained stable enough for continued observation without immediate intervention. His questions were routine, but at the end of his check, he paused slightly before asking the same question I had heard before. Any update from your family? I shook my head. I did not react with surprise. Only acknowledgement. We will maintain medical monitoring and continue contact protocols, he said before leaving the room. After he exited, I realized that the question itself had changed meaning over time. At first, it had felt like reassurance that someone would eventually respond. Now it felt like confirmation that they would not. I turned my head toward the window again. Where the daylight had fully taken over the room. Outside, people moved through their lives with visible purpose. Cars came and went. Conversations happened. Time progressed normally. Inside this room, time had become something different. It no longer measured anticipation. It measured continuation without response. I thought about my mother again, not in anger, and not in confusion anymore, but in a quieter form of understanding that had developed slowly across the night and into the morning. She had not simply failed to answer once. She had failed to answer consistently across every attempt, across every escalation of urgency, across every moment where her attention had been requested in a way that should have overridden everything else. That consistency now carried its own meaning. It was no longer an accident of timing or circumstance. It was a choice repeated often enough to become a pattern. I closed my eyes briefly, not to sleep, but to process the weight of that realization. When I opened them again, nothing in the room had changed, but my understanding of it had settled into something irreversible. The hospital had continued to respond to me with structure, attention, and care. My body had been monitored, stabilized, and observed without interruption. But outside of this place, in the space where family response was supposed to exist, there had been only silence. And in that silence, I finally understood that what I had been experiencing was not a temporary absence of communication. It was a sustained absence of priority. And that distinction, once fully recognized, could not be unseen.